So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Compassionate Community Care's second talk of our series on elder abuse prevention. Today we have with us an acclaimed expert, renowned lawyer and speaker, Mr. Hugh Scher. And just as we start our presentation with Hugh, and I let him take over, I'm just going to introduce quickly our organization, our work, and some of what we've done in the last little while that will help you, hopefully, and those you care about and your loved ones. So today's presentation is Protecting Seniors. It's part of a seniors, and it's called Elder Abuse in the Modern Family, what you need to look out for and know. It's the second event, like I mentioned, of our series, and we'll have Hugh join us shortly. Our organization's name is Compassionate Community Care. We are a registered charity in Canada comprised of healthcare professionals and volunteers who provide support to vulnerable persons and their families during times of illness and crisis. We at CCC believe that all human life has equal dignity and value, and that every person deserves to be treated with respect and compassion while receiving the care they need and deserve. Whether you are facing a chronic condition, a disability, or end-of-life situation, we're here to help. And so what we'd like to do is just share with you a little bit about what our background and our work and our services includes. We can help you find the answers to questions about end-of-life concerns and find the educational and support resources you deserve. We have a helpline, which is 24 hours, 7 days a week. We get calls literally 24 hours, 7 days a week on our call line. The number is 1-855-675-8749. And what that allows you to is be in touch with someone who is there available at any time to listen, to answer questions, provide help, support, resources, assistance. And we do so many things on this spectrum. So it can be an array of things. For example, we help with patient advocacy, conflict resolution between families, education, resources. We also share advice and consultation regarding issues related to euthanasia and assisted suicide. Training programs, which we offer routinely. Actually, bi-monthly, we host online workshops for you, so you're free to join anytime, and that's provided by us free of charge. And these programs are guides for visiting with others and how to provide care and also ultimately support for others in your community. And ultimately, we are comprised of people who care to build communities of compassionate, caring individuals and dedicated members, leaders, and volunteers within their own communities. So why did we partake and start this series? Well, ultimately, we did a study, and thanks to this study, we examined what loneliness looks like. And some of the fallout from that showed that across the last 3 years in Canada, we conducted a study of seniors, elderly, people 55 and over. And we found that there was a lot of feedback through that study that people found that they were lonely, despite, obviously there was lockdowns and mandates and things in place for many places across Canada. We found that there was a lot of loneliness that started during COVID, even before COVID, and since as well. And so some of the feedbacks that we received are listed here. Some of the feedback from seniors especially has said that they are assisted by and supported best by health, feeling positive and active around one another, being visited, especially if they're shut in. And various people in groups, for example, want younger people to visit them. So if you'd like more details about the survey and our report, that's available. It's on our website. It's called Honoring Our Seniors, a survey of Canadians impacted by the COVID pandemic. And some of the feedback we saw that seniors did really well are those who continued on with their daily life as usual. This was a trend we saw. They acted no different. They carried on. They actually stayed quite active socially with others in their community. Some seniors we found felt more isolated than ever before. They experienced loneliness, isolation, and frustration. And these were common experiences among those who were very isolated and socially withdrawn. And they were often feeling that they were abandoned by others as a result of the pandemic. The final group, and there's a third smaller category, that found that they managed to do very well with a single person in their life, perhaps a friend, a pet, or even their own faith or belief system. And they managed by having a person that checked in on them. So their spouse was there available, maybe a friend or dedicated volunteer, or someone who visited them routinely and had assistance and at least some support from that person. This included even having a pet and their belief system. Ultimately, what we found from this survey and experience is that many felt abandoned or cut off from their communities during the pandemic. And those who said they were able to deal remained quite positive, but they didn't experience the depression or feelings of despair that were mentioned by many. And they had busy lifestyles with connections and met regularly throughout with family or loved ones. And as a community, we found that this is something we can look up to, and we can do better, and we absolutely should and need to do better. One of the issues that we found through the study was that abuse was an issue among vulnerable populations before COVID, and even the pandemic brought out more of this awareness since we discussed it during our survey. Although many of the survey responses expressed a concern about elder abuse among other senior populations, not many of them actually said they were feeling that way, that they were abused themselves. But since then, we've decided we need to show more awareness because there's many things that happened during the COVID pandemic in other centers across Canada, as we know that the government had intervened in, that showed alarm and showed a need to resolve and support seniors across Canadian homes and settle and residences. So some of the summary that we have available is featured on our website. It's beingwith.org, and you can see that. There's two reports. One is a longer one, which is around 75 pages. The other one is, and that's more detailed. And then there's a shorter 5-page summary that's available as well for you to view. And also as a way to support, we've created a resource, which is a fantastic opportunity for you to learn about what types of elder abuse are, draw more awareness to the different types and forms of abuse. And it's a very short brochure, but it's also providing a support system that you can refer to if you need to, if you experience elder abuse or if you know someone who might need this extra value or support. So the first of our series was done on May 11th with these two individuals who happen to be registered nurses, and that's available. The recording is online, and you can see it on our website under the events tab. And ultimately, today we're going to discuss this in more detail, but what we found and concluded from these series is that it's very important to be an advocate for older adults and know that there is support available, that there's ways that you can go about to handle these situations. And I'm sure Hugh will outline some of these for us. So allow him to take over, but ultimately know that we are here to support you. And as Compassionate Community Care grows with our work and our helpline, we ask that you please keep us in mind. If you know of anyone who needs assistance or support, to please do reach out. We're here for you. So without any further ado, we would love to welcome Mr. Hugh Scher on his topic on elder abuse in the modern family, what you need to look out for and know. Hugh is an experienced Toronto health, human rights, employment, and constitutional lawyer. He has been involved in multiple precedent cases, including the Rasouli and versus Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre case, also the Bentley versus Maplewood Seniors Care Society. If you'd like an actual complete listing of some of the cases he's been involved with, I will be happy to send them along to you. It is quite an extensive list. So I applaud you, Hugh, for all of your work and accomplishments. You are an amazing work and force behind you, and you just, we're so appreciative of your time today to spend this time with us and to share your knowledge and expertise. Hugh lectures regularly to lawyers, community representatives, universities, and government on these issues. They're very important issues affecting all types of ages of individuals and backgrounds. And he's frequently asked and called on by experts, by patients, families, and community groups for his expertise. So thank you, Hugh, very much for being with us today. And I ask you to join us and share your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy.
Thank you.
So as Kathy says, my background and expertise really lies in the area of health and human rights law, which includes representation in large measure of many people with disabilities, many patients, many family members, as well as those that have been subject to violations of human rights, abuse of various kinds, and harassment and discrimination of various kinds. So that's sort of the bulk of what I do, whether it's in the healthcare setting or a family law setting or in an employment law setting, often engage with these issues. And so what I'm going to take you through today is sort of some of the leading principles that describe what elder abuse is, who are the parties that are often most subject to it, who are the general perpetrators of it, what are the regulatory authorities and agencies available to address it, and what individuals and families can do both to be aware of what to look for regarding elder abuse and how to take steps to enable seniors and their families to best prepare themselves to avoid situations of abuse and or to address them where they arise. So that's what I intend to cover today. What I will say as an opening is that, elder abuse is sort of a broad category that is aimed to cover a whole host of different kinds of abuse. And it's not, if you will, a term of art in and of itself. It can apply to physical abuse. It can apply to sexual abuse. Most commonly, it often applies to financial abuse of seniors. And I'm going to take you through what those different aspects of abuse look like, because each of them have their own regulatory regimes and authorities that may apply. Each of them have their own resources that may be available, and each of them have their own aspects that you should be both aware of and be aware of how to respond to if you become aware of a situation like that. So let me start by saying that abuse, broadly speaking, including elder abuse, can happen to anybody. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. It doesn't matter if you're in a strong family unit or a non-strong family unit. It can happen to anybody, and it can happen in a variety of different circumstances. There are certain situations where it's more likely to happen than others, and we're going to talk about that. But it's also impacted by social norms and understandings within our communities. It's impacted by cultural norms, because different cultures may have different views about how people with vulnerable situations are to be treated, be they seniors, be they people with disabilities or otherwise. And that can sometimes impact these things. And, again, it's going to be impacted by financial situations, by living situations, by who one's living with, the area where one's living, whether one's living on one's own, with a family unit, in a retirement home environment, or in a long-term care facility. Each of those bring with them their own aspects of potential abuse, risk factors, and again, regulatory authority and potential responses that enable people to respond. So I'm going to go through in some detail sort of each of those different areas. I'm also going to talk about some of the healthcare related issues, because it's one of my areas of expertise. So how, for example, healthcare decision making can often give rise to and forms part of the abusive environment, and how, for example, treatment decisions near the end of life, how guardianship applications work, how powers of attorney come into play and can be both a source of aid and a source of abuse. So those are the things I intend to cover today, and I intend to leave as much time for questions as possible. I've given a written presentation, so a written paper that sort of summarizes all of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I don't intend to simply read from it at length. I'm not going to use it as a PowerPoint just because I find it distracting, but it's available to you. And so most of the things I'm going to be talking about are things you're going to have available to you in the paper. So you don't have to feel the need to take notes of everything I'm saying, because you've got a record of it, in a point form type 20-page paper. Okay. So to start with, I mean, as I say, elder abuse is generally something that happens to people who are more senior in age. And it, like I said, it takes different forms. Okay. It can happen to anybody, any older adult. And, there are certain things and certain risk factors that will often come into play as to who may be more subject to abuse than others. Some of those situations and factors include, the fact of being and the need to be more dependent on others, whether it's family, whether it's care providers, whether it's healthcare providers. Those can be risk factors for abuse. Obviously, they can also be great sources of support. So, so it's sort of a catch-22 sometimes. Where there are significant conflicts within the family, that can also be an aspect that gives rise to risk of abuse. So it's something to be on the lookout for. Where a person is no longer making decisions for themselves because of either age or because of health-related concerns or both, that's another situation where obviously they're in a situation of vulnerability. somebody else is being called on to make decisions on their behalf. That could be healthcare decisions, that could be where do I live decisions, that could be situations and decisions around property, around money, and often that is the main source of abuse that we see impacting older people and seniors. So another aspect can be if people have other conditions, whether it's addiction or depression or mental health related issues, or also more broadly, more physically disabling conditions. Those are situations which can potentially put people into greater risk of abuse. So again, the need to be aware of those factors, to be mindful of them, and how to address them, we're going to talk about. Who are the abusers? You know, I mean, there's no way to specifically define how an abuser comes about or who represents an abuser. But often we will find that abusers come from people that are very close to us because they are in a position to exert influence, power, and control over our lives in different ways. So very frequently and sadly, abusers will be family members. They will often be partners or spouses. They may be people who live with seniors. They could be neighbors or landlords. And they could be, as I say, caregivers, be they family caregivers or be they third-party hired caregivers or caregivers in facilities who are either paid or not paid to help the individual, but nevertheless may take advantage of the individual. One example I'll give is, I had a situation involving a patient, an individual who was living at home, who required caregiving assistance on a fairly consistent basis. And there was a caregiver coming in that had bottles of vodka in her purse and was, drunk on the job, and who was effectively, putting at risk this person who had very high level medical needs, including, the need to avoid like latex because of a severe allergy that could have killed her, and was effectively, engaging in the use of latex gloves that were the subject of the allergy and could have put this individual very much at risk of death. So I mean, some of the situations are very extreme and covert like that. Others are frankly more often much more, I would say they're much more subjective, but they're, you don't notice them. They're not as outright. You know what I mean? There's degrees, right? It can be, well, I need a little money and you've got some money and I'm just going to take it. I'll pay you back. Don't worry. Or it can be, oh my, we need to move you out of here because, you can't live here now and we can get a lot of money for the house now, or we should sell it. So let's do that. And we'll put you in a home and we'll take care of you and we'll just take care of your money and guard it for you and invest it and, put it towards your future. And maybe some of it goes there, some of it doesn't. That's frankly the most common kinds of abuse we see financially. And even so, for example, when people have powers of attorney, that gives them basically the ability to act in the same role as the individual themselves regarding property decisions, if it's a power of attorney for property. So basically, that puts significant power and control in the hands of the holder of that authority. And so whoever is choosing a power of attorney wants to make very clear and think very carefully about who they're selecting to play that role, and that they have the relevant trust in that person, be it a family member or not, in order to help them. Now, the challenge is that so often these are assistance that are provided by family members, because those are the people generally most close to us. And so often you'll find family members put into these roles, and where they perform them admirably and in the interests of the individual, that's the best scenario. But unfortunately, there's a lot of power and control that enables them potentially to skim off the top, to take some money for their benefit. And it's not like the individual senior is reviewing the books all the time. So they're depending on trusting in this individual. And so there's a significant risk of potential abuse. And something obviously we always want to be mindful of and be on the lookout for. So those are just some of the parties that are often in the situations of abuse. Those are some of the risk factors. Different types of abuse. As I've indicated, there are aspects of physical abuse. Physical abuse, as you'll appreciate, is when somebody hurts you or harms you. You know, it's abuse if they hit or punch or slap or push you. An assault basically on your person. It may be where they confine you or they restrict your movements or restrain you, which may often happen, for example, with people with Alzheimer's or dementia, or those in other more senior positions with other related conditions. They can be potentially more subject to these kinds of concerns. And sometimes it's legitimate, but sometimes it's a form of abuse, and it is harmful to the individual. So sexual abuse, you'll appreciate, happens when someone touches you in a way that you don't want to be touched, or makes remarks of a sexual nature without your consent and that are offensive, or forces somebody to have sexual contact with them in a way that they don't want, such as touching and sexualized kissing, or being forced to perform other sexual acts. And of course, the use of power and positions of authority to force somebody to engage in sexual acts, whether it's a family member, a doctor, or a caregiver, these are all aspects of sexual abuse that form part of the broader elder abuse category. And they don't just apply to seniors, they can apply to anybody. But often seniors, because of their significant positions of vulnerability in many instances, are sometimes victimized in this regard. Emotional abuse is another frequent occurrence, along with financial abuse, that we see very often with seniors, because sometimes we just don't have the patience and the tolerance to address the fact that people are slowed down, that they may not be as responsive as they were in prior years, that they may not be as understanding of what's being said to them as they were in previous times. So emotional abuse can sometimes rear its ugly head in different forms, and sometimes it's subtle, and sometimes it's quite overt. And we'll talk a bit about that. So emotional or psychological abuse happens when somebody, insults or humiliates an individual, where they blame or shame the person because of potentially a change in their situation, like they're not as fast as they were, they're not as their memory's not what it was, or in any other ways, where they put people down or threaten to do harm to them, particularly if they don't follow their directions. You do what I say, or I'm not going to give you your food. You do what I say, or I'm not going to ensure you have your rent money. You do what you say, or you're going to end up in a home, are all potential aspects of emotional abuse for seniors. Bullying is another issue. It's sad in some ways. Obviously, our parents, when we're young, take that trusted role of nurturing and raising us to become the adults we are. And often, sadly, it's given back to them in forms of bullying and harassment in their later years. And it's not obviously always by family, but third parties as well. And so, the notion about bullying people, causing them anxiety, putting them in situations where they feel at risk or they feel at harm, both physically, emotionally, or financially. These are all aspects of elder abuse that we need to be aware of, need to be mindful of, and need to be on the lookout for, because more people than we realize are subject to these things. One of the other aspects you'll find commonly is that people will stop their senior relatives from communicating with other friends and relatives, isolating them from their broader community, preventing other family members and friends from visiting, controlling their religious beliefs, controlling their activities and who they interact with. These are all indicators and symptoms of potential abuse, right? Sometimes there's good reason, and sometimes these actions are done to try to keep people away from abusers. So it's a balance and a delicate line, but these are the kinds of things we need to be very mindful of. Financial abuse, again, one of the most common, is typically represented where we see people dealing with their others' money or controlling how people spend their money. This can be through the misuse of a power of attorney that's given to another, granted to a person, who basically has the same rights and responsibilities to respect, to address property as the individual themselves, whether it's to pay rent or bills, but then uses those money for their own personal gain and personal benefit. It can also be where they don't act in accordance with the individual's wishes. Just because somebody else may have the power to spend, that spending is to be taken and carried out in accordance with the best interests of the person and in accordance with their express directions. Most people are in a position still to give directions before they get to the point where they're not, right? So, I mean, many senior people are still, they may not be able to do the nitty gritty of the keeping of the books, but they can still say, make sure my rent is paid. They'll still say, make sure I've got these things. Please make sure I've got this birthday present for this party that's coming up. And, to the extent that these things are not addressed or fail to be addressed, or again, where there's a question around a housing situation, do we keep the house? Do we rent? Do we move to a home? These are common situations of utmost autonomy of the individual, right? How is their autonomy and their dignity and respect for them to be best respected on the one hand, so that their needs are met? And on the other hand, they represent situations of potential financial abuse from family members who may say, well, oh, don't move into the home. I'm going to come in and live with you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm not going to pay rent, mind you. I'm not going to pay the bills. I'm not going to bring in my own food, but you got plenty. That's often an example of potential financial and emotional abuse. And of course, nobody wants to say no to their child or whatever. Children may have their own situation where they've just moved or where they're in a situation of transition. So they may think they're doing this for the best, but the question is it for the best? What are the motivations and what is actually happening? Is the child coming in to help the parent with regard to making sure their groceries are there, making sure that the rent is paid, making sure that they're contributing if they're living with them in a way that supports their own living needs as a guest, if you will, in the home, even as a family member? Or are they there really just to take from and to effectively benefit from the situation of the senior to their own personal benefit, whether or not it's helpful to the individual or not? These are things to be wary of, and frankly, they're some of the most common kinds of elder abuse that we see. So again, another aspect may be pressuring the individual to do something they don't want to do, like sell your home, sell your jewelry. You're not going to be wearing it again. What do you need that diamond for? We can get you good money for that. That can be used to support your expenses. Well, that's not the decision of me or you to make. That's for the individual to make to the extent they can make it. And wherever such decisions are made, they should be and must be made in accordance with the best interests and particularly the wishes of the individual themselves. And they shouldn't be, unilaterally forced to do things that may be in violation of those wishes and best interests. That's not to say that there can't be a reasonable discussion about where are we going to live. But that should be a discussion. It should respect to the extent possible the autonomy and the dignity of the individual and their views to the extent those can be communicated. And most of the seniors I know and deal with who are not to a point where they're not able to communicate or otherwise make decisions for themselves are very vocal and or very clear about what their views and feelings are, even if they're not necessarily able to operationalize all aspects. So, having a meaningful discussion about what's in the best interest of the person, where to live, whether it's time to have in-home care assistance, whether it's time to have care assistance from outside, whether it's time to consider moving to a retirement home or to a long-term care facility. These are all reasonable and appropriate questions in particular circumstances, but they need to be done in a way that's respectful of the individual dignity, autonomy, and the wishes and best interests of the person themselves, not just the convenience of the third party. And often that convenience of the third party is the driving force, and it can be an abusive and coercive measure. So again, things we need to be mindful of. Neglect. Neglect is a form of abuse. So that's where someone who's agreed to care for and assist an individual fails to do so. That may be, for example, in failing to provide necessities of life, whether it's groceries, food, drink, or it may be ensuring that you're able to get to doctor's appointments and or ensuring that you're able to do the things that need to be done, paying taxes, filing tax returns, doing the various things that we all need to do in life, which people may have agreed to do to assist with, but then don't, and then leave these things neglected. Okay. So again, where that's happening, people may find themselves on their own. People may not be visiting. People may not be attending. They may have committed to something and then, life gets in the way. So these are some of the most common forms of abuse we see. And again, the issue is how to address it. And there's different mechanisms we'll talk about in a moment. Improper and incompetent care. This is where, the care that you have, be it a third-party care provider, a family member, or a healthcare provider, does wrong by the individual, giving them the wrong medication, accidentally hurting them when moving them around, making mistakes or doing things wrong when giving care, giving too much food or too much drink, too much sugar, not enough medicine, failing to give medicine when in a timely way that's supposed to be given, are all examples of that. So that's sort of the broad outlay of sort of the kinds of abuse and sort of the triggers and the common subjects of the abuse and the perpetrators. What can we do about it? Like, how do we address it, right? Who can we talk to? Well, first of all, you want to be aware that there are certain individuals that have certain obligations in terms of reporting, whereas others may not. So depending on to the extent one wants to keep certain things private, one needs to be aware that there are certain individuals, for example, doctors, nurses, social workers, lawyers for that matter, who all have reporting obligations where they suspect or they believe that abuse has occurred, that they have to report it. Okay, and I've had that occasion where I've had to report situations of abuse to authorities for investigation. For clients where I felt there were situations of abuse, and I'm legally obligated to do it. And if I fail to do it, I can be subject to disciplinary action or fines, as the case may be. Same is true with these other professions I've spoken about: teachers, nurses, doctors, social workers. So, it depends on the degree of the abuse here, whether or not one wants to give rise to that kind of a reporting obligation. Right? Sometimes one may want to have a quiet, private discussion between parties, and that's fine. In which case, you're not necessarily going to want to engage the third-party professionals. But where one does, and often it's very appropriate to do so, there will be these reporting obligations. So, what's a crime and what's not a crime? Right? Certain abuse, elder abuse and otherwise, is criminal conduct. Okay? If I physically hit you, that's an assault. If I take money out of your bank account without your consent and use it to buy my own Porsche, that's theft and fraud. Okay, so that would be criminal. But if I say, you really should sell that diamond, it's really not doing you any good. You could get a lot of money for it, and wouldn't you be better off? And then we do that, that's not a criminal act in and of itself, right? But it could be improper, and it could be done for improper. It would be improper if we sold it and then I pocketed the money. That would be a criminal act. But there are certain things that are criminal and are not. For example, if my caregiver tells you that you're worthless, that's abuse. It's not crime. If a caregiver tells you that I'm going to physically hurt you, this could be a crime, even if they don't carry through with the threat. It may be a crime if someone, even a family member, takes your money without asking, or uses your identity without your authorization or consent improperly. Okay, and that some of these things may be fraud, assault, uttering threats. Again, the term elder abuse is a broad category of conduct. It's not one aspect of conduct in and of itself. It represents a myriad of different kinds of a conduct, be it of a physical, emotional, or financial nature. And again, if there's a serious risk about imminent abuse, imminent harm to the person, look, 911, call the police. right? I mean, if it's really serious, someone's that you can tell they're being hit and abused, call the police. They'll come and they'll do an investigation. Perhaps it's an opportunity to call, for example, the public guardian and trustee to do an investigation, third party, to determine if there is a situation of abuse or a need for some level of third party oversight. In the long-term care or the retirement home environments, there are regulatory bodies and investigative bodies that enable the complaints to be made, investigations to be carried out, and potential punishments to be meted out, both to the facilities and to the individuals who work within them in terms of their conduct. And as well, many of these homes will have their own internal policies around zero tolerance for abuse and neglect, and zero tolerance for discrimination and harassment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Look, in terms of your health and well-being, if you're mentally capable, you have the right to make your own decisions. You have the right to choose what's best for you, and you have the right to protect and to maintain your quality of life as you believe it to be most appropriate. You can choose how and where you want to live. And this is true even if family, friends, or caregivers don't agree with you. Where you live puts you at risk of being hurt or getting sick. That's important. That's an important decision. For example, you can't be forced to move to a new home. This includes moving in with family, or into a long-term care home, or into a retirement home, or a place that offers supportive living, unless you agree to do so, or unless you're deemed incapable of making that decision for yourself. So examples of such, how do you avoid something? Staying as independent as possible is one of the ways that seniors try to maintain their dignity, their autonomy, and control. And some of them are very good at it. I mean, I've seen parents tell their children, put them in their place quite squarely. This is my life, this is my money, I earned it, now you stay back. I paid for this house and nobody's damn well taking me out of it. I mean, I've seen these situations firsthand. So staying as independent as possible is one of the ways of seeking to avoid abuse and maintain autonomy. So how do you do that? Well, one of them is have your own phone, open your own mail, think carefully before you decide to have somebody move in with you, or before you decide to move in somewhere with somebody else. Try to keep in touch with friends and family so you're not isolated and alone. And don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it. If possible, take control of your health care. Like I said, absent incapacity, you're the one in charge steering the ship. And even then, your substitute decision makers are bound to the decisions and to the values and beliefs and the wishes that you've expressed for them to follow. If, for example, you get sick or have an accident, look into the different options for getting care. Look into what different options may be available in terms of assistive devices and equipment, bathing chairs, safety bars, walkers, and canes at home. If you live in a retirement home or long-term care facility, talk to your nurses or other staff or the management if you're not happy with your care. Raise concerns. Most of these facilities have sort of patient boards, and there's patient bills of rights that direct how these things are to be implemented and the rights of patients and residents. And similarly, there's policies generally in place about zero tolerance for abuse, neglect, and discrimination and harassment. Your finances and your property, again, given that financial abuse and property abuse is the most common, try as much as you can to be involved and aware of what's happening with your money and your belongings. Try to make sure you have information about your accounts, that you review any legal documents like mortgages or banking documents. Stay as up to date as possible. Review your account documents just to make sure if someone's helping you that the money's there that should be there. And what's been taken out is stuff that you've authorized to be taken out. Don't share your passwords or PIN numbers or credit card or bank cards with others. Again, another way of maintaining independence. Do your own financial transactions where possible. Use online or phone services if you have a hard time and need some third-party assistance and you can't leave your home. When dealing with your property, Ask someone you trust to look over contracts and other papers before you sign them. Don't be afraid to reach out to a lawyer to assist in reviewing any contracts or gaining advice. We can be helpful resources. We have a broad base of knowledge. Get advice in particular from a lawyer if you're thinking about transferring ownership of a property or a mortgage, including to a family member. It's another added checking source, and it also ensures that things are being dealt with from an estate planning perspective, from a personal perspective, and from an oversight perspective. There's a level of accountability built into that relationship. Lawyers can help you to understand how doing a will can affect your estate, what taxes may be paid, what tax measures may be addressed, how to structure your affairs in a way that's most tax favorable, and that most is reflective of your wishes. Often you'll come to lawyers to assist with preparation of wills and for powers of attorney. Now, powers of attorney operate while you're alive. Wills take effect after you pass away. So, the sad thing is where the will becomes a central feature even while you're alive, because that suggests that there's an added motive that may not be entirely proper, where somebody's more interested in what happens when you're gone than what's happening while you're here. Something to be mindful of. Getting help in making decisions. Talk to your family, friends, and others who you trust if you need help making decisions, particularly about your own healthcare, your own living situation, the supports you may need. If you become incapable to make decisions, a substitute decision maker steps in under the Healthcare Consent Act. Either they're appointed by way of a power of attorney, or if there isn't a power of attorney, then the Healthcare Consent Act provides a hierarchy of, children, parents, siblings, who automatically become your attorney for personal care and your substitute decision maker in making healthcare decisions. Okay, it's less true with regard to property. So property really needs to be designated, and failing that, you may need to bring what's called a guardianship application for a person who lacks the capacity in order to be able to make decisions for the person. And that's something that most seniors would want to avoid because it can be a time-consuming and expensive process. So always best to have powers of attorney for personal care, for healthcare, and for property in place. So you've got a trusted family member or a trusted representative, family or not, to make and assist in those decisions to carry out your wishes, rather than just leaving it to a further court process through like a guardianship process or a consent and capacity building process to address any disputes. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Who decides if you're mentally incapable or lacking capacity? Those determinations are typically made in different situations by different people. Usually there'll be a capacity assessor of some sort. So for example, your local LIN, if you're going into a retirement home or a nursing home, will have a social worker or an assessor who's going to make a capacity assessment. If you're doing a guardianship application, there needs to be a formal capacity assessment done, often by a psychologist or a medical doctor who's qualified to make that assessment. Under the Healthcare Consent Act, as I've indicated, there are hierarchies of decision making, who's authorized to step in. So again, your power of attorney for personal care is intended to address what your wishes are. If there are specific wishes you have regarding specific healthcare measures, like I want to be kept on a ventilator if there's a reasonable prospect of my living, I want active measures for treatment, or I don't want heroic measures and I want palliative care and comfort care, to be the guiding force. Those are two very different perspectives, and I'm often called in where those perspectives are in conflict. Where a family is saying the person wants aggressive care perhaps, and the doctor is saying, well, we're not going to do that. And we don't think that's in their best interest, and there's a fight about it. Those are cases I'm often called on to address. Okay. Being forced to move. People may try to force you to move in with family or to a long-term care home or to a supportive living. Again, friends and family can be great supports, but they are not the determining force in these decisions. And so make sure that you gain insight and wisdom, but you're in charge and you make those decisions. Again, powers of attorney for personal care. Those are where you expressly set out what your specific wishes are. You can actually provide a specific list, or you can simply indicate a representative decision maker, a family maker, or you can do multiple decision makers to act jointly or to act separately in making healthcare decisions that are respecting your wishes and your best interests. The same is true with regard to property. You can set out your powers of attorney for property, and those people step in to your shoes to make decisions regarding your property and your finances, paying bills, selling and mortgaging property potentially. So there's a lot of power and a lot of authority. So you want to be careful. It's often wise to get legal advice in addressing these issues because of these power and authority questions, but it's not necessary. Online, there are examples of powers of attorney that can be made available. The Euthanasia Prevention Coalition has templates. This organization has templates, I'm sure. But lawyers are the ones commonly called on to advise people with these. They're not that expensive to do, and they're usually done in the context of preparing your will. I'm not going to get into a detailed discussion on the estate planning issues and things like that. That's not the scope of today. But lawyers can be of assistance there, as can financial advisors and accountants. So be mindful of that in that context. I want to talk just about 3 more points, and then I'm going to open up to questions if that's okay, Kathy. So the next thing I just address is under the Healthcare Consent Act, as I've indicated, if there's a dispute regarding treatment decisions, and treatment decisions are defined very broadly, okay? It can be basically anything done for a diagnostic, palliative, related purpose. So it's very broad. And treatment decisions have been included to include the withdrawal and the withholding of treatment. So for example, if I'm on a ventilator and there's an existing plan of life support in place, before a doctor can remove that ventilator, they require consent of the patient or the substitute decision maker. And so that is also a frequent source of conflict, sometimes between family members, but particularly between families and between doctors. And those are cases where I'm frequently called in to try to help to mediate those resolutions, or alternatively, to raise a complaint to the Consent and Capacity Board where there's a conflict between the wishes of the patient as reflected by the substitute decision maker and the issues and the beliefs of the doctor as to what's best. Long-term care and retirement homes, let me speak briefly about that. They're important. I mean, like I said, they're governed by different regulatory bodies. The Long-Term Care Act governs long-term care facilities. It includes a patient's bill of rights, purpose of which is to make sure that long-term care homes are truly homes for the people who live in them. It deals with things like treating patients and residents with respect, having staff treat individuals politely, recognizing their dignity and rights, avoiding abuse, both mentally, physically, and financially. And they provide for, aspects of the roles of visitors, the roles of workers, all of whom have obligations to report abuse where they see it. And the only people that don't necessarily have the obligation are the residents themselves. But again, there are complaint mechanisms available at these facilities, both individually within the homes, as well as to the authorities, whether it's the long-term care ministry or whether it's the regulatory authority for the retirement homes, the regulatory authority for retirement homes. There are complaint mechanisms. They will have investigators come in and do investigations of abuse or of the perceived harassment. And they will investigate those and make reports. They'll make management decisions and recommendations. They'll make binding orders on facilities where there's been a failing or neglect in the treatment or a breach of some of these policies around abuse, discrimination, or otherwise. Again, there are different responsibilities for different parties, but there are different numbers available. The police, Crime Stoppers are all available to hear complaints about imminent concerns. Homes and community care, bound by the bills of rights, bound by the Ministry of Long-Term Care, bound by the residential facilities authority, all with complaint mechanisms and all with different authorities. Guardianship, let me speak briefly at the end on this. Guardianship, like I've said initially, is where basically gives the person complete decision-making authority, both with regard to personal care, healthcare decisions, but also regarding property. And typically kicks in situations where there isn't a power of attorney to appoint the person, particularly on property issues. Guardianship applications require applicants to submit a guardianship plan, to submit a management plan for how the person is going to be dealt with, for example, housing, finances, emotional support, program support, things like that. So there needs to be a management plan dealing with all those issues, and there's also a guardianship plan that needs to be submitted as part of the guardianship application, in addition to a capacity assessment showing the lack of capacity. I've done many of these over the last number of years. They're usually the situation of last resort, as I say, because there's no power of attorney in place. And they do provide that broad authority. But again, sometimes you'll get a situation where there's a conflict between family members as to who has the best plan. So one relative wants mom to come and live with them, and the other relative wants mom to live in a retirement home, and there may be a fight about what's in mom's best interest in that instance. And should we sell the home or shouldn't we sell the home? That was a case they dealt with a few months back. So those are the kinds of issues you get. Like I said, issues of elder abuse raise complex social, financial, and legal issues. They impact a wide variety of people. I don't care if you're rich or you're poor, everybody's potentially subject to this. And there are a variety of regimes in place. There's a variety of supports in place, be it the police, be it the ministries of long-term care, the regulatory authority for residential care facilities, family members, nurses, doctors, police, and lawyers. So there's a variety of supports as well as community organizations. There's in my paper sets out some of the additional supports as well in particular, but subject to your questions, those are sort of the things I would wanted to raise to your attention today. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hugh. I appreciate that. I'll pop over quickly and share with all of you, because we don't want to take time away from the presentation and the questions. So if anyone has a question, they can pop it in the chat, or they can raise their hand or unmute themselves. Anyone? Okay, so I'll just read a few, maybe Hugh, to start. Someone, excuse me, someone asked this earlier, and just move over to it. Okay, so an individual asked, is it true that a person cannot be recorded without their permission? They had asked a family member for a drive after surgery from a hospital, and after a 10-minute conversation in the car en route to their home, they were told that they were being recorded and later recalled this. When they asked a police liaison, they were told that it's illegal to record a person without prior permission. Isn't this a cross boundary without general knowledge, since they thought that it was saying that it was confidential?
I think the broad answer to that question is yes, that's broadly true. However, in the age of cell phones, I can tell you, I don't go into any discussion, including today, with you without expecting that what I'm saying is going to be recorded and may well be reported on the front page of the Toronto Star the next day. That's just how I live my life. Maybe I'm paranoid, but I've lived too long and seen too much. You know, I know that clients record me all the time, be it in the office or on the phone. And it's just become a reality of the modern communications world we live in with smartphones, that it's just become common occurrence. And you know what? There can be good things to that, because if there's negative things that are being done, there's nothing, you know, if I haven't said anything I'm not particularly concerned about, then I'm really not that concerned I've been recorded. I prefer it obviously when people ask me. And sometimes people with disabilities are seen, you know, they'll want to record things so they have a record of it and a memory of it, both to hold me accountable, number one, but more properly, more likely, so that they can, you know, have a record of what was said, so they don't have to rely on their memory alone. And I'm usually very accommodating of that. So the answer to the question is generally yes, that's true, but in this modern day, you can almost expect that recordings are going to happen.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hugh. Hugh, Cliff, I think you have a question. Can you unmute, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming here today. I'm just wondering, like, I worked in a hospital for like 10 years, palliative care, and dementia unit was part of I was involved with. And plus, even from my own personal end, things I've seen. Now I'm retired, and if I was to actually go back in history and report things, how would I do it? Like, I could write out maybe 30 years worth of stuff, including documents that I know where they are, and start like something going, but I don't know if it's in my best interest and if it would go anywhere and it's worth doing. I've seen so many things that aren't appropriate that I don't know where to begin. And it would be just a cathartic thing to write it out. But I don't always waste my time, because to me, nobody really cares, especially when you're going back in history, when people are retired, and it's like the system is so, in my view, so corrupt that I don't even bother even addressing it.
So I guess I would address that two ways. The first thing I would say is that to the extent you want to rely upon such information, examples, and experiences as an educational tool, that's certainly one benefit potentially, such as what I'm speaking about today, right? I mean, I could give tons of examples. I've given a few, but I can sit here all day and tell war stories. But I haven't done that. But I mean, certainly that's what you're talking about in part. So there's an education component to it that can be quite useful. There's a law reform potential aspect to it that can be quite useful potentially. If you're talking about specific complaints against specific people after years and years and years, it becomes much more problematic, but not impossible. And, if it's a question of what your motive is, what your intention is, and what you intend to drive from it. I mean, I would say focus on the educational, focus on the law reform, focus on the policy development, so that prevent these things happening in the future, while at the same time using these examples. The second thing I would say is be mindful that as a former employee, you're bound by certain other potential obligations to your employer. And to the extent you may be defaming or otherwise putting somebody's reputation at risk, you yourself could put your own interests at risk. So again, while certain complaints to the regulatory bodies, et cetera, have an immunity to them. So in other words, if I make a complaint to the Ministry of Long-Term Care, that complaint is not something that can be used against me for reprisal or otherwise. It's not something that can be used in a court of law. There's sort of immunity attached to the statements I make there that wouldn't apply, for example, if I went on TV and said that, Home A is just terrible place. Don't ever put your family members there. They treat you like dogs, and my God, I can't have that. Right? That would subject me potentially to a defamation lawsuit, even though it may be true. Particularly who those groups are, you can look at the litigation I've done, because some of them will be there.
Now, I can do this from two aspects. Of course, being professional, I'd be very careful what I do. And I'm never saying where I work was bad. I never said that. But when I am saying as a patient myself, like prior to that, I have experienced personally, because I'm disabled. People don't realize that. And even my employer didn't know that. And I've seen some things, because now I have a professional eye when I look back in history and the things I saw. That's what I'm talking about from a patient's point of view. Reporting things, and I know where the documents are. I know where the witnesses are. That's it. And my complaints will stick because I know how to make them stick. I wasn't, when I was at work, I was never allowed to say anything unless I could prove it. So I would never say anything because it would jeopardize my career. So even if
for me to answer that in a vacuum, right? Because I don't know what we're talking about here, but I think I've tried to give you some broad strokes advice. I can't answer about any specific situation because I don't know the details. I would need to know them.
Yeah, I understand. It's just there's risk involved. Even the reason people don't say things is there's risk. That's why nobody wants risk, and it's not worth it. Even as a patient, that's why things don't get reported, in my view.
Sometimes,
things I saw, people are afraid of staff, they're afraid of retaliation. No matter what they say on paper, there's always retaliation.
That goes to that vulnerability aspect we spoke about, because these are people you're depending on for your meals, for your medicine, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want to be pissing them off? I mean, it's a balance, right? But by the same token, people should be free to speak their minds and speak clearly. So it's a balance for sure.
So we'll take another few questions here. If Costas, did you want to unmute yourself, please?
I have a question. I just wanted to know about other places as well for abuse, like psychiatric hospitals or mental institutions with people who have schizophrenia or depression or anxiety. And about these people, sometimes they don't have the freedom as other people do. Sometimes they are forced to go against their will and involuntarily be admitted to hospitals. I know that happened in the past. I don't know what's going on nowadays about it. And I know also in the hospital, they don't let them do certain things that they enjoy. They always keep an eye on them all the time, and also I noticed that when I was in the hospital, they were kind of cruel and abusive to some patients as well.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point. I mean, the general situation is that police or doctors can potentially involuntarily commit somebody to a psychiatric facility in circumstances where they are perceived medically to be a danger to themselves or to their others, or there's a serious risk of that. Normally, such a committal happens for like a 24-hour period. It's called a Form 1. But there could also be like 72-hour assessment periods where people could be committed for up to 3 days for purposes of psychiatric assessment into a psychiatric facility or a hospital. And those do happen. They often happen with people who have histories of psychiatric illness in particular, like schizophrenia or bipolar condition or substance abuse issues, or combinations of those things. And they tend to be often people that have repeat occurrences because, say, they've gone off of their medication that they were taking or that they're prescribed to take, and that potentially puts them into a situation of risk or psychosis or other mental health concern. But to address your question within those facilities, the hospitals are still bound by obligations to treat those patients with dignity and respect. And, while they may be authorized during limited periods of time to, for example, administer medications, patients have the right to challenge those form determinations to the consent and capacity board that I spoke about. I didn't get in depth into that process or the mental health aspect of it, but that's where that would come in as well. So to the extent that there's a dispute about a form or about a committal or about a particular treatment measure, like a medication that's sought to be administered by the doctors that a patient objects to, the patient can make an application to the consent and capacity board. The board is obligated to convene a hearing. They will usually have a case conference within a day or so, usually at the facility itself. The doctor is the one typically that bears the burden to prove their case, if you will. And then the patient has the opportunity to call whatever evidence they can, whether it's doctors or their own family members or themselves, to say why they feel that the treatment measure is not appropriate or not in accordance with wishes or is not otherwise lawfully justified. So, I mean, it's a complicated area. I'm happy to answer more questions about it, but it's a tricky area. It's an area that can get quite involved, but broadly speaking, those are some of the sort of core principles.
The other thing is, with hospitals, now they're euthanizing their patients and they use the MAID techniques because now the government passed the bill C7, and which allows doctors more freedom to kill their patients by euthanasia and by assisted suicide. And I'm afraid to even go into places like these hospitals or places of that sort, because I'm afraid that I might be a candidate.
Well, then I can speak. I mean, I serve as the lawyer for the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. I'm a co-founder of that organization with Alex Schattenberg and others from its very day one. And I've served as its lawyer since it first was created. So I've been involved in those cases. I've been involved in all the issues regarding MAID, both from a legal policy perspective and from a litigation perspective. So yes, I understand your concern. I share it, but I would say it's more of a policy concern than it is sort of an individual concern. Look, the reality is that most people that are subject to MAID are requesting it. I mean, almost 99%. The issue is, is their request fully voluntary and fully informed based on their own circumstances, because there are issues associated with the process that are problematic, and this notion about moving towards people with mental illness exclusively being eligible for MAID raises other serious concerns that many psychiatrists and many lawyers and others like me have raised. I've spoken about in the press, I've spoken about before Parliament, I've spoken about in court. But what I would tell you is that, look, the greatest concern in my view relative to going into hospitals these days is not so much about the risk of being subjected to MAID without your consent or authorization, but rather the result of the lack of resources makes it so that it's a more difficult experience, such that they're often rationing resources. They don't have the staff always available in the numbers that they would like or need. And that means you could be waiting longer periods of time for treatment. You may not be able to access treatment in a timely way, whether it's mental health treatment, psychiatric services, or surgery. I mean, I had to give you an example. I had a 35-year-old lady with cerebral palsy who was having an issue with scoliosis in her back. And she was basically told that, well, she couldn't get the operation to help to address the curvature in her back, but she was approved for MAID. I mean, it boggled my mind. This is a musician, talented, smart, and all she wanted is get rid of the pain in my back by giving me this surgery, but she couldn't get access to a surgeon. But they're willing to kill her through MAID. I mean, it boggled my mind. I was just dumbfounded by that situation. I was able to convince her not to proceed on that basis, and work with her to get the support she needed medically. And there've been many cases like that I've been involved in with families, and there's articles I can share with you that speak to those issues that I've dealt with quite recently. But I would say, I don't think you have to worry so much about being subjected to, they're going to ultimately shoot you up with a sodium chloride and end your life without your. And that's the other reason why you want to make sure you've got a good personal care power of attorney who's there, and family members that are there, knowledgeable about your wishes. When you're giving your family understanding of your wishes, make sure that they understand specifically what your wishes are in specific circumstances. If I am 98 years old and I have dementia, and I am not mobile, and I need a ventilator, and I need other care to keep me alive, I wish to have aggressive treatment. I mean, that's the level of detail, sadly, that sometimes is required, and that I need to adduce in giving evidence and adducing evidence at a hearing before the sick capacity board. But we will do it. We do it quite often. So I would say don't be afraid, but be vigilant.
Thank you. Isabel, if you can unmute yourself, please.
I wrote in the comment, my question is both as a health professional and also in my extended family. I'm concerned, not necessarily, of course, I'm concerned by the person who has a health issue, but in French, we say le proche aidant, the person who takes care of that person. And I've seen abuses, when the person who is sick is apt, can make decisions, but expect unreasonable things from his wife, from his kids. I've seen an elderly lady expecting her son to be ready to take her to a doctor's appointment like this, and well, when the person is not an elderly, it's not the same thing, but they're elderly or being abused, as helpers. I'm sorry, my English is not good today, but that's what I meant to say, that sometimes people expect too much from their family. I'm not talking about selfish families. I'm talking about good families, but too high expectations. How are these people protected?
I understand what you want to say. And I'm happy to speak to it in French, but I'm going to speak to it in English so everybody gets it. Let me say in response to that, look, all parties' expectations need to be reasonable, right? I mean, we can only do what we can do, right? And there need to be accountability measures in place, even in the family relationships, right? They can say, look, we're not able to do this now, but we're going to do this at this point, or I'm going to need some notice if there's going to be a doctor's appointment so I can make arrangements at work or whatever. And, so there needs to be, it goes both ways. It's a two-way street. And so, those accountability measures need to be put in place. Guidelines need to be established for both sides. So both people know what to expect, right? And it's really a negotiated relationship, about here's what I can do, here's what I can't do, here's what I'm willing to do, here's what I'm not willing to do. And then the person's going to need to find other resources if that's necessary. And there are other resources potentially available. So whether it's third-party supports and caregiving, whether it's other people that can assist, community groups, bringing people to doctor's appointments. So there's different ways about it, but sorry, you were saying again?
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. They're refusing the third-party help. I have somebody in mind. She weighs a lot of weight. She cannot walk. She's in a wheelchair, and she's expecting her 78-year-old friend to bring her to a doctor's appointment. And the person is herself 78 years old,
Yeah.
And
It may
it's
not be reasonable.
That's it. But that's the one thing. The lady doesn't live with her. But when it's your spouse asking unreasonable things from you, sometimes the women, they don't have a choice, it becomes abuse sometimes.
It can be abusive, it's true. That's why I'm saying you need to have clear guidelines, clear boundaries, right? Here's what I can do, here's what I can't do, here's what I'm willing to do, here's what I'm not willing to do. That's true between spouses, between parents and children, between individuals and caregivers, between individuals and doctors, between individuals and lawyers. It governs any relationship. and yeah, no one can dictate to the other, right? But there are certain parameters of good conduct and best interest that should govern these things, and it should be a two-way street. And I think that's the best I can say. I mean, the best thing is to have clear communication, clear understandings, and where there are gaps in the resources, finding other resources to fill those gaps. These are not easy situations. They don't lend themselves to easy solutions.
No,
Mhm.
thank you
That's
so much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. We have a hand up. It's Jackie. Jackie, can you please unmute yourself?
Yes, of course. Hi, Hugh. I'm just a couple of questions. You answered part of it before with one of your other speakers that had asked you one, but when we look at think of medical treatment, we can sometimes think of some of these complicated things, but can you just verify that it is still true that hydration and nutrition are considered as medical treatment? And my other question was regarding pressure from somebody that might have a power of attorney for healthcare on a person to actually choose MAID. Have you had any of those sort of situations come up yet?
Sure, I'll speak to both of them. Jackie, so nice to see you. Jackie's one of my
And
dear
you
friends,
too.
going
You
back
too.
a long time.
It is.
I won't say how long in fear of aging her or I, but she's just a wonderful person who's done great work for the community. Let me start by addressing the first part of your question, which is in terms of sorry, repeat your question for me 1 second. Sorry.
Yeah, about if you have somebody that is your power of attorney for healthcare, the idea that I don't think we often think that nutrition and hydration would be considered
Let
medical
me address it now. Yeah, sorry. So what I would say is the Bentley case that Kathy mentioned earlier that I dealt with in British Columbia spoke to the question of oral nutrition and oral hydration. In other words, the lady in that case was a woman in a long-term care facility. She was able to tolerate applesauce and desserts, and she was willing and wanting that, and not rejecting that. The family took the view that she had written in certain powers of attorney, and there was multiple different drafts over time that were applicable. And so took the position that the nursing home was effectively causing an assault and battery by putting a spoon to this person's mouth, and that it was effectively healthcare for which consent was required, and therefore that they were violating her because she had written that she didn't want these things. Well, the court in British Columbia, the Superior Court, upheld by the BC Court of Appeal, said that no, oral nutrition and oral hydration were not medical care or health care in British Columbia, or treatment as we would call it here in Ontario, requiring consent, but they were basic personal services. And again, there is a requirement for people to maintain the basic necessities of life, and the failure to do that is actually a potential criminal offense.
Okay.
So to the extent that one's starving somebody to death, that can be problematic and potentially criminal. Now, in the context of artificial nutrition and hydration, there's a bit of a different view relative to that. And I did one case that EPC intervened on where the Consent and Capacity Board actually found, I think it's probably the only decision in Canada on this, but basically found that artificial nutrition and hydration were indeed forms of medical treatment for which consent was required. And again, part of that has to do with sort of the artificial intrusive nature of it, going through tubes and things like that. But again, it's one decision of the Consent Capacity Board. It's the general view of the medical profession that is the case. And that's generally how it's treated as part of an end of life type of care plan. But it's not as clearly determined at this point as perhaps it will ultimately be.
Okay.
But I would say that's sort of the view on both oral nutrition and oral hydration. On the second question about about the power of attorney and MAID, I mean, what I would say at this point is the Supreme Court of Canada in Carter, which we intervened on, said that, that the person had to be consenting and they could not provide an advance consent by way of the power of attorney. The government is looking into changing that now.
Mm-hmm.
And so until there's an actual legislative change that provides for an advance directive, so in other words, building in MAID as an element of treatment decisions and wishes on treatments as part of a power of attorney or advance directive, in order to authorize your substitute decision maker to consent to a MAID to happen, that's not lawful right now. It'd still be illegal. Doctors would be wrong to engage with that because it still needs to come from the person who needs direct consent. And you need, right now, they still need consent at the time of the event itself. So the person has to be capable and competent at the time, not just in advance. And so right now, advance directives are precluded. I can tell you the government's looking and moving quickly to try to change that by allowing for advance directives to enable made as they would for other treatment decisions.
Okay. Hugh, just before I run, would a straw be considered oral or artificial?
I would think it would be oral, personally. I mean, when I'm talking artificial, we're usually talking about tubes like G tubes, stomach tubes, or NG tubes through the nose or through the...
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. Good to see you, Jane.
Thank you. For Amber Lee, if you can please unmute yourself.
I'm going to try and ask my question differently than I had it in the chat, for reasons that might be obvious in the chat. In terms of lawyers, there is the case that a lawyer can also be an executor kind of power of attorney like person for their own family member. And so my question is, are there things that are like conduct regulations, or earlier you had mentioned clear understanding and clear transparency? Is there a sort of guideline for that, for when you are the executor and the beneficiary on the will for a parent while being a lawyer?
I guess what I would say is I'm going to address two situations. One you've asked about, one you haven't. I mean, for a lawyer who's a family member, I mean, they're really not in any different situation than any other family member is, who may be appointed as an executor or as a power of attorney for that matter, right? I mean, there's an inherent conflict of interest anytime you appoint somebody as an executor who is also a beneficiary, but that's true whether they're a lawyer or not. So I don't think there's a difference insofar as lawyers versus non-lawyers, either in the context of executing a power of attorney for a family member or in the context of carrying out the wishes under a will as an executor, than there would be for any non-lawyer. That said, the rules of professional conduct of the Law Society still govern lawyers' conduct, and they include both professional conduct in the office, and they would include potentially legal actions carried out outside the office as well, including in that situation. But let me address the question you haven't asked, which is lawyers who are acting for third parties who aren't family members, as either a power of attorney or as an executor, because that happens quite frequently. I'm an executor on an estate for a long-term client of mine that I have no personal relationship with. And what I would say on that is that I'm bound by the same obligations I am as a lawyer. And I'm also bound by obligations as a trustee, because effectively an executor is a form of trustee. And so in that context, there would be rules that apply. And when I do my insurance, for example, I have to report, and lawyers generally have to report how many estates they've acted on as executor or as powers of attorney when we submit our annual applications for our licensing. And we need to speak to questions related to that. So there is some oversight of it. The Law Society does provide potential oversight for misconduct where that arises. But in the context of the question you've asked, you know, lawyers are in no different position than any other family member when acting in a role as executor or power of attorney for their family member, because there's always an inherent conflict of interest. The issue is the closeness of the person to the family member, the knowledge the person brings about the family member's wishes, values, and beliefs are often used, you know, to outweigh the potential risks. But those risks are still subject to oversight as they are in any other case.
Just one part of the same question. Where, let's say someone is an esthetician who might be an executor in some capacity and also a beneficiary, does not come to that role with the knowledge of law and an ability to tell other people that they are representing that level of expertise. So there is a bit of additional complexity if certain things go awry and the person holds that hat while additionally being an executor and a beneficiary, where an esthetician wouldn't essentially say, you know, by virtue of my understanding with nails, makeup, and other things, I am bringing this to this role, and I am aware of what's happening and what I'm doing, and that everything is on the up and clear. So there's that element that creates a complication, which is why I was, because I'm very, 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 very sure there are many lawyers who wish to assist their family members. So that's why I was wondering about if there was something extra. But from what I've heard you say is that being both beneficiary and executor creates enough complication in itself.
Well, I'm saying that it's the same conflict of interest that exists in any situation where an executor is also a beneficiary, whether they're a lawyer or not. But the other thing I would say is that often when you're dealing with an estate, and that esthetician you mentioned would typically often hire a lawyer to help to administer the estate, particularly if it's a complicated estate, in terms of navigating the application for estate trustee appointment through the estates court, dealing with probate issues if they're complicated. I think that, so you may get legal advice, and that may be a different person than, you know, if it's the esthetician hiring an independent party. And again, any beneficiary can hire their own lawyer for advice if there's a concern about a power imbalance, right, between the lawyer as executor and the lawyer as beneficiary. If there's the feeling of that conflict of interest adversely impacting a beneficiary, then, you know, that beneficiary can potentially seek their own advice and guidance. But in broad strokes, generally speaking, I would say it's probably a benefit, because of the fact that the lawyer will have a level of knowledge and experience potentially in terms of how to navigate these kinds of things. So it's often less expensive and more streamlined in terms of dealing with the estate, just in the same way as it might be if a nurse or a doctor or a healthcare practitioner maybe serving as a personal care power of attorney in the directing of treatment decisions in accordance with the person's wishes, right? The same kind of conflict of interest you're speaking about there. So I mean, obviously, we're dealing with money issues often in the context of the will environment. But so what I would say is the court provides an oversight role in administering an estate. And to the extent there's any breach of an obligation of trust or of the will process, the court potentially can serve as an oversight body to address any such concerns. So I would say that as well.
Okay, so that is a little bit helpful. In the situation, what was a little bit helpful is that the court can serve as an oversight body and they have a bit of a role to that. In the situation in play, there are 3 siblings and 2 siblings have had a conflict with the lawyer, and the 2 siblings have had a conflict that is now stretching on into almost like a 10th year. And currently, and there have been things that have moved out and have become solely the owner of the lawyer. So things that were sort of a common split are now the lawyers. And when questions have been asked around that friction in the family that's been extended, there aren't answers or forthcomingness, and there's been now levels of deceit that have been continuing, and also other extensions of property and other things are still going to the lawyer. So it's been going on for some time where no one has known how to address it. So if the ultimate way is just, it'll just continue, and then there's a court oversight at the end, that might be the way that it gets addressed.
That's not what I'm saying, though. I'm saying, you know, a beneficiary can hire a lawyer at any time. And if there's an issue about how the executor is carrying out those duties in breach of trust or in violation of the obligations under the will, generally the executor has a broad authority and discretion. But if there's an inherent conflict there, the individual beneficiary can bring an application to the court and seek to either to have that executor removed or seek to have directions from the court as to how the estate is to be administered. So basically, one way to address a concern about a lawyer is to have your own lawyer, right? So I mean, that way you've got people with equal knowledge or experience that are able to speak on that same level, and to the extent the court needs to be engaged, that's a third party overseeing body that the issues can be addressed. And I've been commonly involved in those matters on behalf of family members, both without going to court in terms of navigating between lawyers, or alternatively, where necessary, bringing estate applications as well.
Okay, and my apologies, I wasn't seeking to put words in your mouth. I was more
allow you to do that, so that's okay.
Yeah, I wasn't what I was trying to do. I was trying to go, what is an option? And it felt in part like one option is just to let it play out, and when it plays out, address it at a later point, because there's also not wanting to cause turmoil in the situation,
I would advise, generally speaking, you're probably better off sooner rather than later. Get some legal advice, try to get the issues resolved, and to the extent they can't resolve, look to that third party mediator or a court judge to resolve the issue. But I can't get into more detail without knowing.
No, it's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. There is another question here in the chat. What do you recommend if you believe an elder is being taken advantage of, is agreeing to things that is not in their best interest, and is not listening to any advice for keeping their best interest in mind? Do you step in, seek out a lawyer, call the police? For example, the elder is agreeing to sell their home to a family member, but the price is below market value. There are no plans for where the elder will move to, and they're not now living in a dark basement of their home while renovations are happening above them. This elder also suffers from regular periods of depression, is currently in a depressed state. Do you mind speaking to that, Hugh, please?
Yeah, those are the kinds of situations I was referencing in my presentation. I mean, I think some things that can be done is, if there's one option, might be to request the public guardian trustee to conduct an investigation. Another aspect may be to hire a lawyer to bring an application. Again, it depends on where the elder is. Are they in a residential? If they're thinking about selling their home, they're probably at home. Depends on what their level of capacity and competence is in terms of making decisions. If they're capable of making their own decisions, then it may be a question of undue influence or something like that. Then sometimes engaging a lawyer or the police to try to balance the scales may be a way of negating the problem. But there's sometimes, it sounds like in those situations, some kind of investigation is probably warranted, just to make sure there isn't abuse going on, whether it's the police, a lawyer, and or through some other body, whether there's a regulatory agency through the Ministry of Health, Long-Term Care, or otherwise that might apply. And otherwise, potentially to hire a civil legal lawyer to do a review and possibly an application. So those are some of the public and private avenues of recourse that are available. And another place to consider, and one of the great sources of information beyond myself, is a group called the Advocacy Center for the Elderly, ACE. ACE is a legal aid clinic that specializes in seniors-related litigation and advocacy and issues around vulnerability. And I spent years on the board of directors of a group called ARCH, which is the same thing for people with disabilities. So that's where my background is. But ACE and ARCH are two very good organizations that have a lot of depth of experience and knowledge on these issues. And again, that would be another place to reach out if you wanted some additional legal advice on a legal aid basis. Okay.
Thank you so much, Hugh, for your very informative and thorough presentation. Everyone here has his notes available. I've sent them multiple times throughout the chat, and have sent them also in the email. All of you will receive another copy after the talk today. And once this recording is made available, I will definitely share it with you through an email and link. So thank you very much, Hugh, for your very insightful presentation. We appreciate the time and work that went into this. And thank you for speaking and addressing some of these individual concerns we have. I will say here, there is a contact form for Hugh and his law professional corporation. There's an address here that's listed. There's his phone number and email. So I will share that with you as well. There's also an Ottawa address for those of you who are located at the capital, and I can share that with you as well in that email. So feel free to note that here. In terms of our upcoming series, which we are finalizing, there's another series happening session. This is the final series, or sorry, session in the series, and it's with a speaker from the prevention. She's a prevention consultant from Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. She'll be outlining her presentation, what it constitutes elder abuse, what are some of the risk factors, and how to report it. And that will be on Thursday, June the 8th, same time as today, Eastern Standard Time. You can join by registering online on our website, beingwith.org. That's www.beingwith.org under events. And ultimately, when we talk about all of these issues, the solution in all of this is that we want to find real practical ways to help people. And the only way to know about issues that are occurring routinely or systematically, or even cases of neglect, are to be involved with people in their life and to be partaking in their day-to-day, or knowing how they are being affected or impacted. So you can do that in a wide variety of ways. Social opportunities, such as having teas at your events, or having events, in your communities. Here's a whole list of ways. Here's my son. We went to visit an elderly home, and we were able to contact and be in touch with people. And, as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, loneliness is becoming more of an issue and slowly an epidemic among many Canadians, as reported to us. And so we find the way to curb that tide is to be involved and be direct and be partaking and being compassionate, dedicated members of their community. Myself and Alex Schadenberg of EPC host bi-monthly seminars on this very topic and give you practical tools, very simple but extremely pragmatic and practical tools for you to do this, to go out into the community, become trained to be dedicated members of your community and volunteering and visiting with people. It's called the My Story Being With My Story Visiting Program. And it's a training that happens over 2 days. It's live like this over Zoom. It's very interactive. And the next one is hosted on June 6th and 7th from 7 to 9 p.m. both evenings. And you'll graduate knowing what it takes to be a visitor and being able to be out in your community. And using the tool of the My Story program, which is a very practical tool. It gives you a book, a handout, how to actually speak and be with and interview people you're meeting with. So you can hear their legacy, their story, and capture those beautiful memories they have in their life and bring them back into the fold, bring them back from isolation and loneliness and depression, and give them a renewed purpose to live and to be hopeful. So this is wonderful. One other thing that we've added to this is our training on patient advocacy. And exactly, Hugh, what you're sharing with us today, we review a lot of these points in our training. So this is a great, snapshot and lead into our patient advocacy or community advocacy training, which we also do via Zoom. It's going to be, the next one is on June 13th from 7 to 9 p.m. It's free. The resources are free, so we can send you mailed copies to your actual address, so you can have that beforehand. So feel free to register as well online under our events tab. And this is the real point, is that this event and these events ultimately are leading people back to one another in community. And so one of the ways we do this is capturing these stories by a local group of women in the CWL. And we've published this. So if you'd like a copy, feel free to let us know, or you can create your own series and your own copies so that you can actually have this as part of your group or your mission or part of your own legacy that you want to leave for your family or loved ones. These are some pictures, and they're very beautiful, hopeful stories that show the perseverance, struggles, but ultimately the hope and faith that people encounter in life. And by capturing their story written down, they have that opportunity. So it's a very nice gift to give to others that you know, even your own family. I also want to just mention and remind you all that we do have a free confidential helpline. Cases like the mentioned here today, I let Hugh take over. So thank you for being our host, answering all the questions. But usually myself or Alex and others will be involved with answering these very delicate, intricate, complex family relation type questions. So we do encourage you to reach out to us if you have any issues. If you know someone who needs help, perhaps someone who's being abused, even feel free to reach out anytime. We can assist you with that in those topics. And our work is, obviously very impactful. So we do appreciate your support. We are a registered charity. These events are free, resources as well, but we do encourage you, if you're able to, feel free to please reach out to us and support us. If you're able to donate, we appreciate that. You can do donations online or via phone. You can contact us anytime. And on our website under donations, you can actually link and actually donate any minute, get a tax receipt, and we send out tax receipts. So you will have that for your income taxes. And definitely reach out to us if you need any more materials or resources. There was some questions in the chat about having more resources sent out, which we're working on compiling different regional areas that will have resources locally based. So I'll work with Hugh on that as well and reach out to him. So we'll all be in touch, and please do stay in contact with us. We definitely want to hear from you. If there's a final chat question, I'm not sure if there is, I'll just check. Oh, someone said they're in the United States. Yes, so is there such an organization here? Hugh, I'm not sure if you're aware of anything there that you would refer someone to.
In terms of what? In terms of elder abuse issues or other like euthanasia type issues or things like that?
I believe they mean this in terms of elder abuse prevention.
I'm sure that there are. I think
Sure.
these are probably dealt with on a state-by-state basis rather than a national basis. So I suspect each state's going to have its own set of resources and supports in different ways. I'm not as familiar with the US situation and how they structure that. I suspect if you reached out to the Advocacy Center for the Elderly here in Toronto, they would have connections with the US equivalents or the US resource sources in a way that I don't readily have available. So I would suggest looking into that because they would have a broad connection internationally, I suspect.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you so much. And that's that's very insightful. So thank you again for everyone for we took a little bit of overtime, but I'm glad that everyone was able to join us and stay with us. So Hugh, thank you again for your wonderful work and everything you've done in terms of VPC and CCC. We really congratulate you. It's an amazing accomplishment and continued effort. So thank you for that.
Thank
Everything.
you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.